Hi everyone and welcome back to our channel. Now before we get into today's video, I just want to say a quick little reminder to please subscribe, hit the like button if you enjoyed this type of content. We post 2 to 3 times a week and we like to talk about stuff that would give you the heebie-jeebies. So unsolved mysteries, true crime, paranormal, cryptozoology, all that fun stuff. So if you are a fan, please hit the subscribe button and the like button, or maybe even just leave a comment below. It really does help us grow here on YouTube. So today's video is going to be an interesting one. We're going to talk about feral children. Now, what are feral children? I'm sure you're all probably wondering. Well, it's actually when children are raised by animals or spend a significant portion of their childhood living with animals to the point where they start identifying as that animal and even adapting a lot of their habits and skills. Now, I know a lot of you probably are thinking that this is stuff that only happens in TV and movies, but there's actually quite a bit of cases that I came across when it comes to feral children, and they date back as far as the 18th century. Obviously, the further back you go, the less information there is on them. But it's so interesting that this has been happening for so long, and it makes you wonder about the human-animal connection and how deep it can actually go. So speaking of movies, we're going to talk today about the story that actually inspired Mowgli and the Jungle Book. If you haven't seen the Jungle Book, it's about a little boy that ends up being raised by monkeys, and he ends up developing these relationships with animals in the jungle. And then there's also the story of Tarzan, whose parents are actually killed, and he ends up getting adopted by also wild animals in the jungle, some monkeys, there's lions in there, and he ends up becoming basically the king of the jungle. In today's video, we're actually going to talk about 3 of these really interesting stories about feral children and their experiences growing up with wild animals. So like I said earlier in the video, one of these stories is the inspiration behind the Jungle Book, and it comes from the Indian boy called Danny Sanichar. Now, this story actually takes place in 1872, so quite a bit ago, and I'm sure we're missing some information about the story, but this is as much as I could find online. Now, Danny was actually found living in the jungle, and it's suspected that he wandered into the jungle as a really young child and just kind of ended up getting lost in there. There was no information on his parents or where he came from, but this actually ended up taking place in northern India. The people who spotted him were actually a group of hunters. They were out looking for, their catch of the day, and they actually spotted little Danny running around with a pack of wolves, and they actually spotted the wolves and Danny running into a den not too far from where they were. So shocked to see something like this, they actually decided to follow the wolves and see what was going on. So they get to the cave and they realize they're not going to be able to go in there and just pull Danny out. So they decide to set a fire and actually push the smoke, and the flames and all of that would actually end up pushing the wolves and Danny out of the cave. And it worked. So as soon as they saw Danny rush out of the cave, all of the hunters kind of just ambushed him and took them with him. From there, they ended up taking him to the local orphanage, where they gave him the last name Sanichar. And at the orphanage is where they kind of realized how bad his condition really was. They were able to determine that he was approximately 6 years old, but his intelligence level definitely didn't add up. They were able to determine that his reasoning skills were way, way below what they should be for a 6-year-old. He didn't know how to speak. He had no idea how to communicate in the local language. And caretakers at the orphanage actually tried to teach him throughout his entire stay there, but they were really never able to get him to say any sentences. He was able to grasp onto a few words here or there, but he was never able to communicate with human beings the way the rest of us do. Now, when it came to eating, this was definitely an interesting sight to see. He would actually refuse to eat cooked meals. He was so used to eating raw food, whether it was raw meat or fruits and vegetables out in the jungle. He refused to eat cooked meal. It was just disgusting to him. And there was actually reports of seeing him sharpening his teeth with bones. Now, when they found him, they actually found him running around on all fours with the wolves. So it was assumed that he had spent a majority of his life walking around on all fours, and it took the people at the orphanage quite a bit to get him to walk on 2 feet like the rest of the people around him. It was definitely an odd experience for him. He had no idea how to do this, so it was a bit of a struggle. Eventually, he did catch on onto how to walk properly, but it was reported that he struggled with wearing clothing. He was found running around naked. So when it came to wearing clothes, it was such an abnormal thing for him that he would often just prefer taking them off and walking around the way he had for so many years. Now, the sad part of this is that because he had basically no human interaction for such an important part of his life, he was never able to establish human relationships. He had very high social anxiety. He wasn't able to communicate with anyone. He had no friends and would actually just prefer the company of animals. Sadly, Danny ended up passing away at the age of 29, so young, and oddly enough, it was because he had picked up smoking, one of the few human habits and one of the worst, honestly, that he could have picked up. He ended up developing tuberculosis from how much of a heavy smoker he was. Fortunately, because he wasn't able to communicate with humans, we'll never really know more details about what happened to him and how he survived out in the jungle, but it's definitely something I wish we could have known more about. But in these next stories, we'll go into a little bit more detail about what happens when you're actually out living in the jungle with wild animals. Okay, so the next story we're going to talk about is about a girl called Oksana Malaya, and this story takes us to Ukraine. She was born a healthy baby. There was nothing wrong with her, but unfortunately that didn't last very long into Oksana's life. Sadly, both her parents were actually severe alcoholics, and they neglected Oksana quite a bit. And one night, they actually forgot her outside. They literally left their 3-year-old child outside at night. So being such a small child and really just running on her instincts, the first thing she decided to do was to basically seek shelter. And the first place that she was able to find this was within a local dog shelter type of thing where the local homeless dogs would gather. Now, because her parents were so neglectful and really just completely out of it, they didn't even notice that Oksana was gone. I know, when I was reading this, I was completely shocked. I'm like, how could you not notice that your 3-year-old child is gone? So because of this, no one really went out to look for Oksana. She was forced to stay with the dogs in the kennel, and she quickly started picking up on different habits and mimicking the dogs that she was living with. Now, because she was also so young, she had learned minimal human habits, minimal human traits, and because she was at such a critical age, she quickly forgot about human interaction because she was only spending her time with the dogs. It took neighbors literally 5 years before they noticed that Oksana was living with the dogs, and this one person finally decided to report it to police. And when they found her, they were actually able to tell how bad her condition had actually gotten. By this point, I guess you could say it was very safe to say that she was much more dog than human.
Oksana Malaya began her life living with dogs. Rejected by her mother and father, she somehow survived for 6 years, living wild, before being taken into care. There are few cases of feral children who have been able to fully compensate for the neglect they suffered. Oksana is now 22, but her future still hangs in the balance.
She would run on all fours. She didn't know how to speak anymore to humans anyways. She wouldn't use her hands to eat anymore. She would kind of just go on all fours and dig in the same way a dog would. She panted with her tongue out the same way a dog would. She would growl, she would bark, and she would even bare her teeth the way a dog would when they're getting really angry. She would do that whenever she felt uncomfortable or threatened. It took many, many years for her caretakers to show her how to basically be a human being again. She was eventually able to learn how to walk on 2 legs again. She learned how to do basic communication, but unfortunately her mental capacity really stayed at the age of 6 years old. She never was able to really learn past that. Now, because this only happened in the 80s, Oksana is actually still alive. She's still living in Ukraine. Now she lives in a home for the mentally unstable. Now our next story is about a young girl called Marina Chapman, and it takes us all the way down south to Colombia. Now this story takes place in the 1950s. When I was doing some research, it was hard to come across an exact year as to when this happened, but all I could really find was that it happened in the 1950s. Now the last thing Maria remembers is actually being kidnapped from her village. She was only 5 years old at the time, so she wasn't able to recall the name of the village where she was living. All she remembers is that she was kind of just hanging out outside, and some man came and grabbed her, threw her over his back, and just started walking into the jungle. And he walked for some time, but then for whatever reason, he just decided to stop. I don't know if he just decided to change his mind or he realized that this was not a good idea. But anyways, he decided to just drop her off in the middle of the jungle and just kept walking. So little Maria was 5 years old in the middle of the jungle, basically left to fend for herself. She was able to remember that she was starving. She was so hungry the first few days that she was out there. She was starving, she was thirsty, and she was not able to find any food. And she actually ended up stumbling upon a family of capuchin monkeys. So using her instinct, she followed the little group of monkeys, and eventually they led her to trees that actually had fruits and nuts available. At first she said that the monkeys really didn't want her there. They definitely did not accept her as one of their own. All of them kept their distance from her and just observed her from the trees, wondering who she was, what she wanted. And this was fine with her. She was okay kind of just waiting it out as long as she was able to get food. But she had to be quick about it because the monkeys would all be eating on their own first at the top of the trees, and then she would be down at the bottom just kind of waiting to catch whatever was left over from the monkeys. One of the monkeys was curious enough to come down and land on her shoulder, and it was said that at this point Maria mentioned that she felt like she had been accepted into the little group of monkeys. Now, because she was 5 years old, she was developing her curiosity. She was still following her instinct, and this is one of the main things that really did help her survive. She was smart enough to actually copy what the monkeys were doing. She was watching them, and so she would basically do the same thing they were doing. She learned how to climb trees. She learned how to pick fruits and nuts from different trees. She learned what was good to eat and what was not good to eat. And the monkeys at this point had obviously accepted her as part of their own. So they had actually started grooming her. You know how the monkeys line up in a line on the tree, all one behind after the other? They were basically just grooming each other, picking out the lice from their hair. There's one story that really stuck out about Maria's experience, and it was one time where she had actually gotten really sick. So she had eaten something, and she's not sure what she ate that made her so sick, but basically she assumes that she was having either an allergic reaction or she was having some sort of food poisoning situation. And her stomach was killing her. She was basically on the ground, rolling and tossing, not knowing what to do. And one of the older monkeys, who she actually referred to as Grandpa, noticed this. So he comes down from his tree and sits next to her and grabs onto her arm and starts like shaking her, like trying to get her to snap out of it or something. And at first she's annoyed because she doesn't know what he's doing, but then she realizes that he's trying to get her to follow him or to like lead her in a certain direction. So she follows his lead finally, and she realizes that he's trying to get her to look downwards, and that's where she notices that there was a stream. So she goes down to the stream and drinks a whole bunch of this water, which actually made her throw up, and it made her throw up whatever was making her sick, because she said that she ended up feeling better not too long after that. And all she could think about was how this monkey had acknowledged what was going on, and he realized that he needed to do something. It was actually at that moment that she realized the monkey that she referred to as Grandpa, was now her family. Now, it wasn't until she was 9 years old that she was actually discovered by human beings. So at this point, she had spent 4 years of her childhood in the jungle living with monkeys. Now, unfortunately, the people that she ran into were not good people, and they actually ended up selling her to a brothel where she was really poorly treated and went through some super traumatic things, but basically she lived the next few years of her life there in really, really poor and disgusting environment conditions. Eventually she was able to escape, but her luck didn't really improve from there. She went to work as a house servant for a really wealthy family, but she later discovered that the family she was working for was actually part of the mafia. So after working there for some time, eventually she was able to escape, and she was able to make her way to the UK, and that's where she actually lives today. And she actually wrote a book where she goes into much more detail about what happened and what she remembers, a whole bunch of different stories. If you guys are interested in her book, it's actually called The Girl with No Name. So if you guys are interested in knowing more about what happened to Marina, definitely go check out her book. Okay, so that does it for today's video on feral children. What do you guys think about this topic? Do you think it's absolutely insane how kids are able to survive out in the jungle just following their instinct and listening to monkeys? What do you think of this means for like the human animal connection? Leave your thoughts and comments down below. Please remember to subscribe, hit the like button, and we will see you in the next video.